All right, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. I normally talk about American politics, but today I'm going to be looking at a little bit of a historical lesson. So today's episode begins with a newspaper. April 28th, 1952, the Daily Worker runs a front page story exposing a practice among British troops in Malaya, headhunting. The image is stark, and the accusation is stark. And it's such a freaky image that I'm not able to actually include it in the YouTube main photo or anything like that. Most likely because it would potentially get me into some trouble as an offensive image. So you're just going to have to do a little bit of research yourself, and it's a pretty horrifying thing to see. For many readers, it must have felt impossible as well. Headhunting was something done by tribes, by so called savages in far off jungles, not by dignified British soldiers, not by representatives of a so called civilized nation, and yet there it was. So, what happens when the violence of empire stops being a distant rumor and becomes a headline at home? So, that's where I want to begin here. In recent years, we've heard a lot about reverse colonization. The phrase surfaces in debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and the supposed loss of a pure British identity. Or we could transpose those sentiments over to American identity and American politics. But for now, I am just talking about Britain for the most part. Obviously, these sorts of lessons, they translate into other scenarios, but we're talking about Britain. The anxiety is usually framed in simple terms. Outsiders are arriving, culture is changing, oh no, the national core is under threat. But that framing misses something deeper. The fear was never only about what was arriving, it was about what was being revealed, because the British Empire did not just conquer territory, it also functioned as a kind of pressure valve. It exported Britain's surplus population, its economic tensions, and its most brutal methods of control. Empire was where violence could be exercised without contaminating the self image of the metropole. It happened over there, out of sight, out of mind. It was done by a certain type of man, a rough man, and I can imagine sitting across from such a person. He might even seem polite, perhaps, nodding at me to continue in conversation. Possibly, inevitably, he'd venture into politics if we were to actually converse. He'd call the enemy bad, he'd call them they, he described them in almost zoological terms, less than human, a problem to be managed, that sort of thing. So the language does the work. Once someone is reduced to they, cruelty becomes easier. And that cruelty was not incidental, it was structural. From Malaya to Kenya to Ireland, the British state created techniques of detention, interrogation, collective punishment, and psychological warfare. They were not rogue accidents, they were methods, they were policy. So when reports like the Malayan headhunting scandal surfaced in Britain, they did not just shock the public, they also threatened a story, and it was considered a very important story. The story was that Britain was different, civilized, fair, benevolent, that whatever excesses happened were exceptions, not expressions of the system itself or anything like that. The scandal suggested otherwise. It suggested that the empire's violence was not contained, it was not safely over there, it was woven into the fabric of British power. This is where the idea of reverse colonization becomes a little bit interesting. On the surface, it's about immigration, but psychologically, it looks more like projection. The fear isn't simply that the other is coming to Britain or wherever, it's that Britain's own history is coming home. The terror is that the violence, the moral compromises, the dehumanization practiced abroad might seep back into the metropole, and maybe it always does. The Palestinian American scholar Edward Said wrote in Culture and Imperialism that empires justified themselves through stories. Stories of civilizing missions, of order, of progress, all that kind of crap. But those empires contracted, and when they did so, he argued that the violence and exploitation committed abroad did not just vanish, they left a debt, a moral and psychological debt, and debts eventually have to be reckoned with. Said also challenged the idea of a pure national identity. Nations like Britain, he argued, were not ancient, untouched essences. They were shaped through conquest, through extraction, through rule over others. So when people speak of protecting a pure British identity, they're defending something that never truly existed. The identity itself was forged in empire. There's an older warning that echoes here. Edward Gibbon, writing about Rome, said, quote, "The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is a history of the victories that had been gained over the natural and wholesome emotions of the human heart." End quote. So think about that. An empire does not just conquer others, it has to conquer empathy. It has to override ordinary human responses to suffering. It has to train its citizens and soldiers to see some lives as lesser. And that victory over compassion may look like strength, but it's a corrosion, and corrosion spreads. The headhunting scandal in Malaya wasn't shocking because it was alien to Britain, it was shocking because it actually wasn't. It revealed that the line between civilization and barbarism was thinner than people wanted to believe. So when people worry today about the other coming to Britain or again coming to other so called civilized places, it can serve as a distraction. It's easier to focus on outsiders than to examine the internal inheritance of empire and violence. It's easier to talk about cultural dilution than about historical violence, but the other was never fully outside in the first place. The empire shaped British institutions, language, wealth, borders, even the idea of Britishness itself. The practices developed in colonial settings influenced policing, surveillance, and counterinsurgency at home. And of course, when you go out and try to conquer the world, you're going to expect to interact with those others out there. So, as the empire contracted, the facade of a benign nation had to work harder to hold. The real fear may not be demographic change after all. It may be that as power fades, the moral and psychological debts incurred abroad become harder to ignore. The story of a uniquely civilized, restrained Britain starts to crack, and what's revealed at the core is not purity, it's conquest and filth and degradation. There's a line from the Gospel of John, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But truth can also be destabilizing. To accept that British identity was shaped by empire is to accept that its violence is not an aberration. It's foundational. That doesn't mean it defines every person in every possible way. It doesn't mean there's no good. It just means the story is more complicated than the myth and more vile than the myth, and perhaps more honest. So the question then isn't whether Britain is being colonized in reverse, it's whether it's ready to confront what it once exported, to imagine the habits of thought, the hierarchies, the language of they that were cultivated abroad as being a problem. That's really what's at the core of these anxieties. The the idea that, oh, we're actually not on the correct side of history. So, because if those habits remain critically underexamined, they don't disappear, they adapt. The empire may shrink, but the mindset can persist. And the image from 1952 still lingers. You can still find it pretty easily in a simple Google search. A newspaper exposing something many would rather not see is still a necessary function of a free press. Headhunting by British troops, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a mirror. And sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't what we see in the mirror, it's realizing it was always there in one form or another, and that it is perhaps the truest expression of what we truly are. That is what unsettles people the most if they actually look at these issues, that these most disgusting images are the most accurate and truthful